I wonder if you might say a word with me. Not that word. All together now. Zewa. Zewa. Taneho. Zewa. Taneho. What a strange and wonderful word. It's not Spanish, though you would be forgiven for assuming that it is. It's an indigenous word from the native tribes that once lived along the Pacific coast of Mexico. People who occupied the land long before the Spanish conquistadors arrived. It is a town, once a tiny little village about 150 miles up the coast from Acapulco, though it's much, much larger now for reasons that will soon become evident. But in ancient times, Zihuatanejo, or just Ziwa for short, was the edge of the known world, the brink overlooking eternity. It was a paradise called, ladies are going to love this, the place of the women. It's a good paradise, right? That's the literal translation of Zihuatanejo. And what they believed is that there were these divine women who lived on the beach there, and they would lead the sun to its resting place each evening. And after they helped the sun settle into the sea for the night, as the legend goes, for anyone who had traveled the long, almost impossible journey to reach Ziwa, the goddesses would then wash away any painful memories that those people had as the sun set and cast all of their regrets deep into the Pacific Ocean, never to inflict pain on those people again. Zihuatanejo, a holy place of healing, a window into eternity, a paradise where the injuries of yesterday are forever washed away. And it would have remained as such if Mexico had not paved paradise and put up a parking lot. In 1995, only 20,000 or so people lived in the entire region of Ziwa. 30 years later, the population of that community is closer to 150,000 people. And Zihuatanejo has become the third largest and most visited resort community on Mexico's Pacific coast. In a story that sounds like one that you might have heard here, 2 million tourists a year now flood into Ziwa, not so much to forget, but to make tropical, all-inclusive vacation memories. But you can't lay all the blame on the Tourist Development Council of the Mexican government. The lion's share of the blame falls at the feet of these two men, Stephen King and Frank Darabont. Back in the 1980s, Stephen King wrote a little book, not even 100 pages. Darabont saw a screenplay hiding inside King's novella, a movie that he thought would be a blockbuster. So for $5,000, he bought the rights to that book. But King never cashed the check because he thought it was such a fruitless effort he didn't want to steal from the man. Years later, Stephen King returned that uncashed check to Darabont, framed in a gilded shadow box with a note that said, "In case you ever need bail money, love, Steve." Because Frank Darabont took that little book entitled The Shawshank Redemption and in 1994 produced one of the greatest movies ever made, if not the greatest. It has been the #1 film at IMDb, who ranks such things, since 2008. And it put Zihuatanejo on the map. This is my last talk, as Anna has said, in this series entitled Genesis at the Movies. As such, you must indulge me for one more Sunday. There are 3 movies that I have watched over and over and over again in my life. The Godfather. If I hadn't been born Irish, Scot-Irish, I would like to come back one day as an Italian. The Godfather. Number 2, Unforgiven, which Gene Hackman won an Oscar for Best Supporting Actor, God rest his talented soul. And that 3rd movie is The Shawshank Redemption. If you have never seen it, shame on you. You should stand up right now where you are, ask forgiveness from the rest of us, and go home right now, don't wait, and remedy this sin. It's $3.99 on any platform that you choose, and it will be a spiritual investment. 142 minutes of a religious experience. I am not underselling it. It'll be much better than any sermon you'll hear from me today. The aforementioned Gene Hackman, Robert Duvall, Clint Eastwood, Paul Newman, Tom Cruise, Tom Hanks, Kevin Costner, Johnny Depp, Nicolas Cage, Charlie Sheen, Brad Pitt, James Gandolfini. They all passed on this film. And they all regret it. But who needs them when you have Tim Robbins and Morgan Freeman? Tim Robbins, only 36 years old at the time, played the role of Andy Dufresne. Andy is an upright, honest, straight as an arrow banker. They exist. Wrongly convicted of killing his wife. He is an innocent man sent to the Shawshank prison forever, for life. And once there, he is abandoned by his family. He is abused by the guards. He is sexually assaulted by other prisoners. He is often in solitary confinement because of his conflicts with the warden, who is a little sawed-off, Bible-quoting, hypocritical, murderous, money-laundering little dictator. But Andy never gives up hope. He never loses faith. And he says to Red, played by Morgan Freeman, who seemed like he was 100 then, but was only 57, "Dear God, help me." He says this to Red: there are places in this world that aren't made out of stone. There's something inside that they can't get to, that they can't touch, that's all yours. And Red says, "What are you talking about?" And Andy answers, "Hope." Red, hope is a good thing, maybe the best of things, and no good thing ever dies. And hope keeps Andy alive in a place he did not deserve to be in. This hope keeps motivating him, animating him, driving him, until finally, miraculously, he escapes from prison by slowly digging his way through a concrete wall and flushing himself out the prison's sewer pipe. I'll quote Red now. In 1966, Andy Dufresne escaped from Shawshank prison. All they found of him was a muddy set of prison clothes, a bar of soap, and an old rock hammer near wore down to the nub. I remember thinking it would take a man 600 years to tunnel through the wall with it. Old Andy did it in less than 20 and crawled to freedom through 500 yards of smelling foulness I can't even imagine. 500 yards. That's the length of 5 football fields, and he came out clean on the other side. And where did Andy take his newfound freedom? Zihuatanejo. A slice of paradise on the Pacific. He would say to Red, "They say it has no memory." That's where I want to live for the rest of my life. A warm place with no memory. There's another indigenous word, not unlike Zihuatanejo. This is Genesis 41:51. While in Egypt, 2 sons were born to Joseph. He named his older son Manasseh. Let's say that together. Manasseh. For Joseph said, God has made me forget all my troubles. If you're looking for Andy Dufresne in the Old Testament, you will find him in the person of Joseph. But you would never purchase the movie rights to his life story. You would never accept a starring role because it is all too unbelievable. It's far too improbable for moviegoers to be attracted to. Here is this upright, honest, straight as an arrow young man. His only crime in life is that he is his father's favorite son. Obviously and obscenely so. His father is always protecting him, always promoting him, always showering him with gifts, and especially, as Anna has already referred to it, this royal, flashy, multicolored, technicolored dream coat. It's impossible for us to understand the significance of such a gift today. It's a garish display of favoritism. The time it would have taken in those ancient days to find all the berries and the dyes to produce such a multicolored garment. The tedious nature of the manufacturing, like your grandmother hand-stitching a quilt, but without the advancement of a sewing machine or even steel needles. And it was obvious what it meant when Joseph wore that coat, bouncing around home like a peacock spreading its fan. Not only am I the favorite, he was saying, but I'm the heir apparent. I will be the one who assumes leadership in this family one day, even over all of you, his 10 older brothers. So there is always this talk of how Joseph is the big man and how he was going to be the man one day. And his older brothers hate and despise him for that. But then one day, they get their chance. Let's move from the prison camp, shall we say, to the old great Wild West. Here are his brothers out with the herds. Now imagine the scene. The cattle are strewn across the beautiful green fields. They're grazing beneath big sky blue. The Israel brothers, they sit atop their saddled horses. They're keeping watch, chewing straw, spitting tobacco, sharpening knives, swatting flies, telling dirty jokes, or whatever it is cowboys are doing out there. And in the distance, they see this lone rider breaking over the horizon. Who's that? One of the brothers asked, squinting into the afternoon sun. And of course, just as he says this, the sun catches the rainbow veneer of that multicolored poncho that the writer is wearing. And they all know that it's Joseph, sent as daddy's eyes and ears, that sniveling little tattletale straw boss come to spy on us and to report back to our father. Then the cussing and the spitting really starts. We ought to string him up while we got him out here to ourselves. That little greenhorn fancy-ass dreamer that he is. Now that's an idea that gets some traction. Knives are really being sharpened now. Knots are getting tied. Guns are being loaded. And after a minute, the oldest brother speaks. His name is Reuben. What a great name for a cowboy. Reuben. And he has the most to lose if Joseph does indeed become head of the family, because that place belongs to him. He's the firstborn. But he wants no part of bloodshed. And so he turns to his brothers and he says, here's what we'll do. Those Apache mule skinners are going to be riding south into Old Mexico in the morning. And they'll come right by here on this trail. Hell, why kill him when we can make a few pesos off of him? We'll sell him, tell Daddy that he's dead, and be done with him forever. And that's what they do. To their own brother. But it wasn't Mexico. It was dustier and more dangerous than that. It was Egypt. That mysterious kingdom of sand that swallowed people whole. A dead-end land that was an inescapable fortress. Joseph was trafficked over the border by his own brothers into a life of misery. A life expected to be bitter, short, bloody, and impossibly vulgar in its consequences. And Joseph, 17 years old at the time, a kid, ends up a slave, taken by caravan down a winding desert road, never to return. And what if I told you it got worse before it got better? He started out as a slave, and then he ended up in prison. Just like Andy Dufresne, he gets charged with a crime that he did not commit. And I commend Genesis 39 to you for your reading later. He is thrown into prison, a filthy rat hole of a place, to serve a life sentence, and the years drip by like excruciating slow crystals of that desert sand falling through an hourglass. 1 year, 2 years, 5 years, 10 years, 12 years behind bars. 12 Years a Slave, that's another fantastic movie, by the way. 12 years, but the boy, now a man, never loses hope. Because there are places in this world that aren't made out of stone. There's something inside that they can't get to, that they can't touch, that's all yours. What am I talking about? Hope. Hope is a good thing, maybe the best of things, and no good thing ever dies, and Joseph didn't either. By providence, good fortune, karma, God's good grace, the man rises from slavery, out of the ashes of that prison, set free from the cruelty and injustice inflicted upon him by his brothers and seemingly everyone he meets, and he becomes administrator over the entire land of Egypt. God's presence rests upon him like an aura, a holy charisma, and some people just have got it. And he had it. And he employs his share of it to save thousands from starvation, thousands from suffering, including those brothers that had shipped him off years earlier out of jealousy, envy, and hatred. The famine had come to their land too. All their herds are gone. They are starving, but they get word that there's plenty of food across the border down in Egypt, so down they go. and like a specter from their nightmares, or an avenging angel come to settle the score for their past sins, they find, indeed, little brother is the man. He's in charge. And you heard that wonderful reading. When you read Joseph's story, you find two things throughout. He's always weeping, and there are always his brothers throwing themselves down on their faces in front of him. But somehow, he has no revenge to take, no score to settle. There'll be no blood for blood, no eye for an eye. His forgiveness is real, and he tells them, go get your families. Bring them here so that they can live, so you can live. And go get my father, the man now that he has not seen in 3 decades. Go get my father. I want to see him before he dies. He must meet my sons, especially Manasseh. For God has made me forget all of my troubles. And then he says something so extraordinary, so wise and insightful that a few years ago I had it inscribed in ink onto my body. He says, you intended to harm me, but God intended it all for good. Joseph understood his life to be a part of something bigger. The treatment suffered at the hands of his brothers was unjust, it was criminal, but it was also God's means of ultimately saving him and his entire family. He could say with one breath, you sold me, speaking to his brothers. And with the next breath say, God sent me here. In Joseph's thinking, these two expressions were not contradictory. His brothers made the conscious decision to harm their brother by selling him into slavery. It was ugly, it was wrong, it was sinful, yet at the same time, God was using these events to bring something redeeming and beautiful out of that disaster. Now, I don't think this is a universal explanation. There are atrocious things that happen, and offering a tidy little interpretation or a feigned happy ending is an insult to the suffering that has been experienced. And it's the pastoral side of me, I guess. But you don't say to people who have endured tragedy or some inexplicable loss or terrible injustice, you don't go up to them and say, hey, I know this is all really a bummer, but it's all going to work out. You and God got this. Oh, you're too blessed to be stressed. I'd like to punch the next person that says that to me right in the nose. I'm a peace-loving man. I won't do that. The Lord's going to turn this all around. I would rather crawl through Andy Dufresne's 500 yards of prison sewer line than to flippantly speak to someone's misery that way. So no, this is not a blanket explanation to write everything that goes wrong in your life, but it was Joseph's way of making meaning out of his life. It helped him make some sense of some of the things that had happened, and it can help us do the same. Back to that ink on my body. It's here on my arm. We have a saying up in the mountains where I come from. It's on him like his arm. Have you ever heard that phrase? Anybody? Oh, I'm going to educate you today. When someone has some defining quality, and it can be ignorance or stupidity, usually that's what it is. Somebody does something ignorant and you know people that you just can't help? You try to help them, but you can't help them. And when somebody would do something real dumb, you'd say, well, it's just on him like his arm, which means you can't You can't get away from it. Wherever he goes, that dumbness goes with him. So say it with me. It's on him like his arm. It's on him like his arm. Well, I put it on my arm so I wouldn't get away from it. You intended to harm me, but God intended it all for good. Those are Joseph's words. But on my arm are the words of Irish poet Pádraig Ó Tuama, words that came to him as he recovered from decades of abuse at the hands of a Catholic priest. He wrote this: "The answer is in the story, and the story is still being told. There is so much pain, and pain will happen. There seems to be no meaning, but you will find meaning where you give meaning, because the answer is in the story, and the story is still being told. The answer is in the living and in the dying, in the trying, for redemption on a hill of empty crosses, in shoring up hope and the gathering of your losses. The answer is in the living and in the trying. The answer is in the story, and the story is still being told." That story, your story, will keep being told as long as you live and breathe. And after you have lived your life and breathed your last, that story will keep going, just as we tell Joseph's story today, thousands upon thousands of years later. And while there is no magical place that can take away your suffering or erase your painful memories or immediately rescue from whatever troubles you have at this moment, there remains the next page to be written, the next chapter to be drafted, and the next act still to be composed. The answer is in the story, and that story is still being told.